Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jesselyn Noor in Baltimore. In news from Syria, after what was called one of the most intense bombardments in the 5-year-long conflict and widespread reports of civilian deaths, the battle for Aleppo appears to be over. An agreement has been reportedly reached between the rebel forces in eastern Aleppo and the Syrian government. With the growing humanitarian catastrophe there, hastening negotiations which were brokered by Russia and Turkey. Well, now joining us to discuss this is Reese Erlich. He's a foreign correspondent, author of Inside Syria, the backstory of their civil war and what the world can expect, which has just been released in paperback, and Reese is on a national book tour promoting that book. He's reported from Syria 6 times and has visited all the surrounding countries. Thanks so much for joining us. So we wanted to get your thoughts on this latest news, the Russian ambassador to the UN announcing that this deal has been struck, the U.S. saying that they have signs of a ceasefire, the Russian ambassador saying that the rebels would evacuate Aleppo and civilians would be unharmed, and this comes despite Western and UN accusations of the intentional killings of civilians in Aleppo. There's been widespread reports of that. Can you give us your reaction to this latest news?
Well, we'll have to see whether this ceasefire and allowing the rebels to leave and the civilians to be unharmed actually plays out. There's a lot of reason to believe that that may not happen, particularly men of military age seeking to leave are probably going to be taken by the Assad forces. And one side will charge that they've been kidnapped and are being mistreated, and the Assad government is going to argue that, well, they have to sort out fighting men or rebels from the civilian population. So I think we're going to see a period of real tumult in Aleppo and quite possibly human rights violations continuing.
And you've been to Syria 8 times. Is there any way to really know what's going on in a place like Aleppo? Because there's so many conflicting reports in the Western.
It is difficult. Yeah, it is difficult. So far, there have been no independent reporters allowed in. It's been too dangerous, for one thing. Hopefully, in the days ahead, there will be an ability to get some independent reporters in there. New York Times and other mainstream media have been relying on both handouts from the rebel groups and from the U.S. government, as well as whatever contacts they can reach by phone or by Skype. And there's been clearly a lot of propaganda on both sides. So the rebel side has misled people with a lot of false accusations. The only people that seem to die on the rebel side are civilians, and they downplay the fact that they've been hit pretty hard militarily. The Assad forces, they lie and put out their own propaganda, claiming that they're being very careful in their bombing, they're not hurting civilians, and it's all lies from the other side. One of the more clever uses by the rebels, apparently false Twitter messages from a supposed 7-year-old girl tweeting about her experiences, and that was swallowed whole by a lot of U.S. media. There's now serious questions about whether that 7-year-old really exists or whether it was a propaganda effort. So all sides are trying to influence international public opinion through propaganda and fake news.
And so talk about what the fall of Aleppo means for the Kurds and for the armed opposition overall across Syria. Is this going to be an end to the conflict, or is it just going to continue?
Well, it's not going to be an end of the conflict. It's a pretty serious blow to the opposition to Assad. Aleppo was the largest city by population in Syria before the war. It's a commercial center. The rebels have held it for 4 years, despite previous onslaughts. So the fact that they were driven out is very significant from a military standpoint. But at the same time, the Islamic State retook the city of Palmyra in the east of the country, which had been seized by the Assad government. So the fighting and the fighting around Raqqa, where the Islamic State is headquartered, is intensifying. So the war is by no means over. One of the more interesting developments has been with the growth of the Syrian forces fighting in Rojava, the northern region of Syria. The PYD, or the Democratic Union Party, is a secular party, considers itself on the left. is involved in promoting women's rights and women equality and leadership. They have a women's militia. And more recently, they've helped initiate Arab militia groups. That is, they're not of Kurdish origin. And they're fighting in around Raqqa. And they were fighting in Aleppo. There's a Kurdish enclave in Aleppo itself. And a lot of civilians had fled there. And in most recent developments, the Kurds are at least claiming that some of the Arab militias that were defeated by Assad are joining them or will be joining them. And if that actually happens, that's a very significant development, because you no longer then have Assad on the one hand claiming that he's fighting a terrorist, everybody opposes him, were terrorists, and on the other hand you have these extremist groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda, for example, who really engaged in horrific human rights violations in Aleppo. And if some of the less extremist groups do in fact go over to the Kurdish side, that's going to make the situation much more interesting and much more significant.
And so, obviously, President-elect Trump is going to be coming into office in just a few weeks. We've heard
it's hard to pronounce those words, isn't it? President Trump.
Exactly, it is. We're all still getting used to it. But so we've had some analysts on who have said that pro-regime forces in Syria responded to Trump's election by escalating this military offensive. What are your thoughts on that? And what
I've heard that it's not really accurate. First of all, the offensive started well before the election results came out, and secondly, probably the stand that Turkey has taken had much more impact than anything that the elections in the U.S. had. Specifically, Turkey finally decided that they were going to put a stop to the infiltration along the border, and particularly the infiltration from Turkey into Aleppo of arms and extremist fighters. When they did that, that really had a major impact on the fighting in Aleppo. And the Turkish government has basically decided that the Kurds are a bigger enemy than the Islamic State or Assad. And they're making all kinds of tactical alliances with that in mind. So in the long run, it's very dangerous, because having them fight the Kurds, as I just mentioned, the one group that has some kind of popular base that's not based on religion or ethnicity and reactionary ideas, the one group the Turkish government has and probably will again attack them. So that stand of the Turkish government had a lot more to do with the results in Aleppo than the U.S. elections.
And as far as what Trump's policy towards Syria could be, he was accused of having close ties to Russia throughout the election, and he's appointed Tillerson, the former head of Exxon, to be Secretary of State, who has, again, very close ties to Russia. Could this Trump administration shift the balance of power in the region, and what could that mean for the conflict?
Well, during the campaign, Trump tried to play this populist card of being anti-war and anti-foreign intervention. He claimed he was the first to read that he opposed the Iraq War when it began, of course, which was a lie, and that he can sit down and negotiate some kind of a settlement with Putin. Well, any negotiations have to be premised on having some kind of bargaining chips, and the U.S. is in a very weak position. Why would Putin give up anything given the current situation on the ground in Syria? So that could lead to a pulling out of the U.S. troops, which would be a great thing. But I doubt that Trump is going to do that. He's got all these generals and Secretary of Defense, Mad Dog Mattis is a sworn enemy of Iran, and he's going to sit down in cabinet meetings and tell us, Trump, look, Iran and Russians are going to win if we don't do something, and that's a disaster for the whole area. We can't allow U.S. prestige to be ruined, blah, 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 blah. We've got to up our military presence in order to have a bargaining chip to work, to negotiate with Putin. And the U.S. already has 500 troops. They're now admitting they have combat troops, which they never admitted before. And so I think, if anything, they're going to turn to 1,000 troops, 2,000 troops, whatever numbers they need under the guise of fighting terrorism to up the U.S. presence in Syria to combat the Russian influence. And when that happens, it's a disaster for the people of Syria. It's a disaster for the American people. We're going to see American troops dying, and tens of billions more dollars wasted. That's my real worry, is that they will whatever Trump claims, they will end up escalating militarily.
All right, Reese Erlich, thank you so much for joining us. Foreign correspondent, author of Inside Syria, the backstory of their civil war and what the world can expect. Just released in paperback, and he's on a national book tour promoting that book and talking about Syria. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.